Happy New Year's. It's been a while since I did a Q&A, but it's a new year, so that's as good an excuse as any to do a Q&A session. I've read through all your questions, and there's everything from questions about Breguet to the grey market to my other hobbies. A lot of you know the drill, but I'm going to recap for the newcomers. My Q&As are as off the cuff as possible. It's stream of consciousness, and that means details and lug widths and reference numbers, might be wrong because I haven't pre-researched my answers. These videos are also longer, so I do less editing and I put in less B-roll. It's more sort of authentic, I suppose. I'm not an expert. I've never pretended to be an expert, so just take my answers as those of a guy that has a hobby like you that he's totally interested in. Fourth, for the most part, I don't profess to be right. I just share my perspective. You are free to have a different perspective and a different approach, which brings me to sort of the last thing, which is share your thoughts in the comments. Be engaged, but be polite. No personal attacks on me or anybody else. Just contribute to the conversation. And if you feel the video warrants it, please subscribe to my channel. It's hugely appreciated, and it also gives me a really good sense of what you enjoy and what you don't. And with that said, let's dive in. I've got all the questions that I've noted down on my phone. So here's the first one. First question is, why isn't the grey market bursting? Is anybody actually buying a Daytona for 25K? Okay, so there was a huge demand for watches. That meant that there was also a huge demand for grey market watches. I think two things happened. Grey market dealers would buy pretty much any watch they could get a hold of, and they would sell it for a premium. That's the first part. Second, more people became grey market dealers. So what happens? Demand starts to drop, which means what happens in the grey market? Well, I think three things happen. One, some grey market dealers went out of business. They were stuck with watches that they couldn't sell, and they had no new customers, which was bad news for them. But a lot of grey market dealers saw the demand dropping, so they did two other things to avoid going out of business. First of all, they stopped buying a lot of watches. And second, they started taking a lot more watches on commission, which basically means they only buy the watch if they manage to sell it. All of those three things led to an overall contraction, I think, in the supply of the grey market watches, which keeps prices higher. And the grey market dealers have rearranged their finances to take on less risk. Only the ones that massively overextended themselves got into trouble. If you were hoping for a collapse in the grey market, I'm going to have to disappoint you, because I don't think it's going to happen, because they've also adjusted to the new reality. Do you think it's time in 2024 to stop calling watches like the Royal Oak, the Nautilus, Overseas, GMT Master 2, and others sports watches? 20, 30, 40 years ago, sporty was something specific. Today, in terms of men's outfits, stuff that was sporty back then is considered almost dressy and formal. You just don't see suits as much anymore, and just clothing and the way we wear things has changed. As far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as a sports watch per se, except maybe for a Richard Mille, the one with the button where you don't over-wind the watch when playing sports. I don't remember the model number. I think it's a Nadal watch that had a button where you could freeze the winding mechanism. Basically, to me today, dress watches are probably the only watches that for some odd reason are still limited to dress scenarios. Most dive watches are not used for diving. Very few GMT watches are actively used to track multiple time zones. Not a lot of perpetual calendars actually function as day-to-day time and date keepers. A sports watch is just a name for a type of watch. They've got nothing to do with sport. They're just watches with bracelets. And it's convenient to have a name for this type of watch, but the time where sport had anything to do with them is long gone. If, there ever really was a time when that applied. Here's a good one. What I'd like, which will never happen, is your insight into the world of horological social media. Opinions on your favorite YouTube channels, online resources, etc. Where are your favorite places to see, listen to, and learn about watches? If you want to learn anything, I believe you have to seek out as many sources as possible. And when I say that, I mean sources that are different. Reading 5 articles with the same opinion is not giving you different perspectives. You have to actively seek out differing opinions and positions. And the same goes for watches. So personally, I read a lot about things, including watches, And I also watch a lot of YouTube and talk to people that know a whole lot more than me, which is a lot of people. But I've got some options. It's not a complete and a sort of all-encompassing list. It's important to say that some of these ones that I'm suggesting have weaknesses as well, but I use them myself because I know what they're good for, which, there's an example, which is Fratello Watches, which is a website which has relatively decent reviews. You just have to be mindful of that. The guy who runs the site, Robert Jan Brewer, is super, super happy with Omega and Speedmasters. And basically anytime Omega releases a Speedmaster, he loves the thing. And as long as you're mindful of that's the perspective he almost always comes with, you can listen to his reviews and his opinions with an awareness of that lens. So in no particular order, Tim Mosso, I think he's got the 1916 watch company. They sell stuff, but he knows his watches and he's super detailed. Teddy Baldassar is good for basic information and overviews about watches, and his watch photography is pretty damn good. ID Guy, I'm a big fan. He has a great perspective on the design aspect of watches. A Blog to Watch with Ariel Adams is usually good with unbiased reviews. They also do paid content, but they always label it very clearly so you know when they are doing paid content. I enjoy Wristwatch Revival. You're terrific. He's got great photography, and he's not afraid to have an opinion about a watch. Reddit isn't bad either. There's a whole lot of stuff in there. You just need to go looking for it. There are tons of forums, Tag Heuer forums, Rolex forums, Canadian Watch something. There's a million of them. TGV is also good. So, just like I said, I read a lot, I watch a lot. There's no perfect site or channel. They all come with their weaknesses and their strengths. And I don't avoid the ones with weaknesses. I just remind myself to be mindful of what they're good at and what they're bad at. And that's kind of the key to it. I'm finding Lume and Power Reserve to be overrated. I admire them technically, but I don't value them economically. Lume is a party trick played with black lights, not real world ambient lighting. PR doesn't matter if you wear the same watch. Oh, Power Reserve. Power Reserve doesn't matter if you wear the same watch daily or if you rotate among more than 4 or 5 watches. What's your experience? This question sort of connects to one of my previous questions and answers. We've got some rules that apply. A dive watch or any type of tool watch has to have 300 meters of water resistance, and it has to have lume. A dress watch has to be manual wind, or at least some people say it does. It's important, apparently, that a GMT has a very specific type of movement, where it's a true or a caller GMT, to be seen as a true GMT. A luxury watch has to be mechanical. A military watch has to be on rubber or on a NATO. It can't be on a glossy leather strap. There are all sorts of conventions that manufacturers and we as buyers kind of conform to. So a dive watch that can't dive just won't be accepted as a dive watch, regardless of whether or not it will actually ever be used for diving. I think it's fine that these conventions are there, but I'm also fine with brands that play with those conventions and buyers that choose not to care. I think there's some classic examples of this. Moser did a dress watch that was made out of a block of cheese, or they also did the watch that looked like an Apple Watch, but it wasn't a smartwatch. Lange and Söhne have taken a luxury timepiece and fully lumed the whole damn thing, even though it doesn't need lume. Lume is a signifier of utility on certain types of watches, but it isn't really needed by the vast majority of people that buy that watch. I mean, really, it isn't. Most people don't benefit from it. If you don't care about lume in a dive watch or a field watch, cool. You're likely not going diving anyway. If you like the watch, you like the watch. And conversely, a lumed Lange is so much a play on traditional conventions because lume is not something you associate with a chiming perpetual calendar or whatever it was they made. New money equals enthusiast. Would love to hear some thoughts on this with some educated speculation. Oh, speculation, I can do that. The way you ask the question, I get the sort of picture of a footballer who just signed like $1 million deal with some big club and he goes on a spending spree. You know, he buys 3 AMGs, a Ferrari, a Porsche, 25 Rolexes, including a Daytona, Rainbow, Platinum Daytona, and some obscure reference of a Paul Newman. I don't think that's all people. Some people come into money and they just want options. So they'd go down to the store and buy 5 or 10 or whatever number of watches in rapid succession. It's not just because they're enthusiasts. I think, they have the money and they want to buy a whole lot of watches. It doesn't make them enthusiasts. It just means they've got options. Just like they've got a whole lot of sneakers. It doesn't make them a sneakerhead necessarily. Having said that, of all the people I know that are into watches, a lot of them, including myself, at some point early in their watch journey had a spending frenzy. They might have gone bananas in cheap or mid-range or expensive watches, but they went through this phase. And I think it's one of the ways some people find out what they like. They just rapid cycle through a lot of options. They spend probably more than they should, and hopefully they come out on the other side with a clearer idea of what they like and what they don't like. I've done this. I've done it with watches, I've done it with shoes, I've done it with computer equipment, I've done it with camera equipment. It's not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. It's not healthy for the bank account at all, but some people just work that way. And if you come into new money, this kind of cycling behavior just gets amplified because you're not blowing your cash on San Martin's, Bugattis, and Eddies dives. You're walking straight into Bucherer and walking out with Rolex, IWC, Omega, and Lange & Söhne. There are those of you that have always been measured and never went through that spree phase. And I envy you and everybody that's capable of that. I mean, if I fell over a hard drive full of Bitcoin, I'd very, very quickly amass myself with a ridiculous number of Pateks and Jeans and Langes and Kronefelds. I don't have the restraint to not do that if I had a pile of money that I wasn't going to run out of. I do hope, for the most part, that my experience that I've gained up until now will allow me for some sort of modicum of restraint if it ever happens. But I'll probably end up buying a Bugatti. I know, I've got no taste, but I like fast cars. Longer question. There's one watch brand that is hardly ever talked about and that gets little airtime. Yet, without the heritage of that brand, today's watch world would not be what it is. Why is that so? And would that brand not deserve more attention? I'm talking about Breguet, no surprise, which will be 250 years old in 2025. P.S. Mike, I love your videos and would not know who better to ask this question to than to you. Best regard from Berlin. Now, it's very kind of you. People that are out there that know more about Breguet, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. There's no objective reason founded in quality or skill that justifies why Patek and AP are more popular than Breguet. I know that Patek had the Genta watch. I know that some of Patek's historical watches are viewed as massively important to the world. But when some random person walks into Patek Philippe or AP, 99% have absolutely zero clue about Patek's horological credentials. They don't know anything about their master watches. They don't know anything about their actual watchmaking credentials. They've got no clue. And that, to me, means that having knowledge of Patek's actual history, and not just that Patek are good, is not part of what makes Patek compelling. And it's also not inherently more compelling than the history of Breguet. But I think the path of Patek and Breguet and the others diverged at a couple of key junctures over the last 30 or 40 years. I think that Patek came with a better answer to the quartz crisis in the Nautilus and sports style watches in general. From the 80s and until now, life has become less formal, and Patek had something that came across as modern and fitting for that kind of scenario. Breguet have remained firmly in the stuffy and formal space. Lots of Pateks are still stuffy, but the power of the Nautilus and the Aquanaut and how they've shaped the brand in the perception of the consumer shouldn't be underestimated. Secondly, as far as I remember, Breguet had business troubles, and I think it was like somewhere in the late 80s where they got themselves into basically business troubles, and the brand and the quality of the watches, I think, were perceived to really suffer in those late 80s and 90s. They fell a lot behind in that time when this was when Patek and the others were kind of picking up steam, but Breguet just fell behind. And I think it was somewhere in the 2000s, I'm going to say 2003, 2004, I think his name was Nick Hayek from Swatch, bought them and they stabilized them and the brand, and they're definitely in a much better place, but it was very much saving a disaster of a brand. Third, I think there's a legitimate question about the modernity of Breguet's collections. Of all the brands I can think of, Breguet, Blancpain, Vacheron, Patek, Moser, Breguet has an aesthetic that just feels to me as the most old-fashioned. To me, Breguet hands are some of the absolute most old-fashioned looking hands, second only maybe to cathedral hands. Breguet also love using Roman numerals. That also, to me at least, adds to the oldness of a lot of their watches. Their main logo, and that they do different logos depending on the watch, but they have the sort of serif cursive logo, which is also super old-fashioned. Even Patek does a Helvetica kind of logo that you see with Hermes and Burberry and Louis Vuitton. The Breguet logo, and they've got different ones depending on the style, but the one on the the 7097 is a very serif kind of font, which just feels old. And then you've got the cursive logo, which just screams Chesterfield couches and Winston Churchill and, smoking on a stogie. They've also got far too much of a love for Clou de Paris on their dials. They also like coin edges a lot. All of these things are like super, super old, and it's just the muchness of all that oldness. They also have these kind of signature straight lugs with the droplets. I know that's what they call this, got a specific term for it. But, you get the point. It looks great, but it's just a style that comes across as not particularly contemporary. If you go through Patek and Vacheron or even Journe, Clou de Paris just isn't nearly as common or prevalent in their designs, and it's just old looking. I think there's a preponderance of design signifiers that make their watches look old-fashioned. It's not on all of them, but a lot of them. And I think that just doesn't hit as many customers in the feels the way a modern Patek or a Moser design does. If you go look at an 1159 from AP or a Streamliner from Moser or any Journe model, even a Patek 6007G, basically go to any other brand at this level and you'll find watches that are aimed at younger consumers. They might not, compared to, Studio Underdog, be really youthful, but they're more modern in their aesthetic. And Breguet doesn't have that to any significant extent. Everything, to me at least, looks old. Fourth, and this is not unimportant, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't wear a Breguet. Actually, nobody apart from Vladimir Putin wears a Breguet. AP is worn by John Mayer and Mark Wahlberg. FP Journe is worn by Zuckerberg. Patek is worn by one celebrity or powerful person after another. And mark my words, you just need one or two authentic opinion makers or trendsetters to wear Breguet, and I think they're back in business. A watch like the Breguet 7097 is ridiculously cool. You can't tell me that thing isn't horologically stellar. But until Breguet make a more contemporary watch that a cool person will want to wear, Breguet are going to stay where they are. What do you think about the Nomos Zurich? Is it worth the money? Absolutely. And I know because I own it. I've got the blue one, and sometimes I wish I'd gotten the white because I think the white is cleaner and definitely more legible, but it's got a cool world timer style complication. It wears like a dream, and unlike a lot of the real world timers, it's not as busy on the dial. I sometimes have a hard time with world time type watches with that globe and everything because they just get really, really busy really quickly. This one just nails it aesthetically. Technically, I don't think it's really a world timer. It's more of a pseudo GMT, but doesn't matter to me. It's a super cool watch. What's a dirty secret that dealers and brands don't want buyers to know? That's easy. That pretty much every Swiss and German brand, except for maybe Rolex, gets something made in China, India, or Thailand, or all three. Not everything, not the finishing. There's definitely value add to watches made in Switzerland. And if you're one of those people that just thinks assembly just means assembly in its simplest form, then I can't reason with you. Stuff happens in the manufacturers in Switzerland that lift the watches to a next level from what they initially get from China or India or Thailand. But it doesn't change the fact. Pretty much all of them source stuff. Bracelets, cases, dials, hands, you name it. The other secret, a lot of the stuff comes from the same sub-vendors. There's so many common components across brands, it's frankly a little bit scary. I've had a lot of conversations with brands now, and at some point there's always someone that says to me something like, yeah, they get their dials from the same people as us and they're marking their product up way more than us, or they're getting this from that guy and he's really good, but we get it over from here and we were in discussions with blah 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 blah. It's just such a small and insular industry, and everybody kind of knows each other and everybody deals business with each other. Are Mont Blanc watches just expensive designer watches? No, they're not, but they shine a light on something interesting that I've been thinking about a bit recently. I had that other question about how we expect a dive watch to have 300 meters of water resistance and good lume. And that's a preconception that the vast majority in the market have. And I think this applies to brands as well. If I say micro brand, I'd guess most people in the know will say $1,500, Selita movement, ceramic bezel diver, and high quality quick adjust bracelet. If I say Nomos, you say Bauhaus. To me, for the longest time, Mont Blanc was a company that made pens. I didn't register them as a watchmaker at all. And just before anybody in the comments is like, how can you not know that Mont Blanc made watches? One, I'm not an expert. And two, everybody starts out not knowing something. Everything has to be learned. And at some point I learned that Mont Blanc also made watches. When I realized that they made watches, I remember the first watches as completely uninteresting. But then they did, I think it was the Geosphere, and I liked that watch. It was a little bit big in the bronze version, and I still think it is. I remember I was going back and forth between that watch and an IWC Pilot chrono with bronze and a green dial. And I didn't buy either because the Pilot was just, a plain Pilot chrono in bronze, and the Geosphere was just too big. But it was a good watch. And I think the guy who's at Breguet now was at Mont Blanc at the time. And with him, I don't know if he did everything, but they have started to do stuff that has a lot more horological street cred. But it's interesting how hard it is to change people's perceptions. It's a combination of, making a good looking watch that, thematically seems to make sense, but you also need some signifiers to tell the world that you're serious watchmakers. So quartz has got to go, and you need at minimum to get yourself that Selita movement inside into your case. You need to hit those specs that signal serious watch, and you need to get them into the display case over at Bucherer and not at your local mall or wherever. So I think there's an interesting question that I'd pose to you guys, which is, are Mont Blanc really watchmakers? And the question then is, are Tudor watchmakers? I mean, frankly, a lot of watches get made without the need for a ton of watchmakers on the payroll. Making a good watch for a lot of brands is about decent design, good supply chain management, reliable assembly, and reasonable quality control. Not a lot of brands actually need to have Kurt Klaus or Roger Smith on the payroll. It's largely manufacturing first and watchmaking craft in a distant second for a lot of the brands. It's still hard. It's still the case that some brands are better at it, but there's just a difference between, classic craft watchmaking and putting together a good watch. So Mont Blanc, they've got nice watches with decent specs. They've got good materials. They've got good internals. They've got some nice designs, but they're the guys that make pens. So they're not automatically categorized with Tudor or Nomos or whoever. And it doesn't make them bad. It just makes the perception of them different. If the Geosphere was a little bit thinner and maybe 1 or 2 millimeters smaller, I'd buy it. Like the Royal Oak being emblematic of the 70s and the Panerais and IWCs of the 2000s, is there a definitive watch or brand for this decade so far? Tudor. End of story. You can hate them all you want. You can think they are boring beyond all belief. You can think they are downgraded Rolexes. I don't care. They were literally nowhere 20 years ago. And from the late 2010s or the early 2010s and up until now, they have dominated in terms of coverage, in terms of praise, and in terms of growth. They've massively pushed other brands to up their quality. The reason Longines watches have gotten better is Tudor. The reason micro brands have such good bracelets is because Tudor have shown that it can be done at that price point. They do Metas at 25 to 30% lower cost than Omega. They've reignited the dive watch craze. They reignited the skin diver craze. I mean, it might have been a little bit Oris, but they definitely had a hand in it. GMTs, they're the ones that have set the agenda for the last 10 years. And before you sort of say, oh, Longines sells many more watches, just remember that Longines have been on a consistent downward trajectory in terms of volumes in the last 10, 15 years. Tudor is one of the few that have increased volumes consistently and generally outperformed the market. What are your thoughts on how watch YouTubers talk about finishing of the watches? Most always just say the finishing is either good or bad and better or worse than another watch. There's very rarely any analysis of finishing, like how well the case is brushed or how clean the hands are finished. Surely with all of the macro shots of all the watches, there can be some kind of technical comparison shown between the finishing of comparable watches as a metric of why one is better than the other. Instead, people often talk about how good the finishing is of the watch while showing on screen a macro shot showing hands with clearly visible burrs or lume not properly filling markers. Fantastic question. I've got a whole lot of perspectives on this one. Part of this is experience. If you've ever hung out with somebody that really appreciates wine, they've usually, not all of them, but a lot of them have developed a palate over decades, and they can spot all sorts of things in that wine that any inexperienced wine drinker can't. And the same goes for watches. Some people have just been doing this for such a long time that they know and look at the anglage on a Vacheron and just know that on this model, the craftsmanship is not up to Vacheron's usual standards. Some people will see and appreciate things because of experience that others just can't and won't. And personally, I'm not a wine expert and I'm not a finishing expert. I just like what I like and I share my experience. And there are very few YouTubers out there that have that level of experience. And in fairness, me, Britt Pierce, and a whole lot of others, we don't claim to be experts. So it's not our thing. There are a few YouTubers in some really niche channels that are experts on this, but they are few and far between. Second, some people are just more detail orientated. I posted a video I'm going to say 6 months back, of my new Pelagos that I bought, and somebody wrote in the comments that it had a fault. I honestly can't remember what it was he noticed, but he saw something that I didn't. And when he pointed it out in the comments, I could see it, but it still wasn't a problem for me. Some people are going to look at some watch and say, this finishing is good. And someone else is going to feel it's not good enough because they've got different standards. And obviously, if someone misses, glaring flaws, then that's an oversight. But there is a bit of this that is down to the subjectivity of the eyes that see. Third perspective, and just to be clear, these perspectives are not complementary. They're just very much, this is one angle you're looking at it, this is a second angle, and now we've got the third angle of looking at it. Finishing is always relative to the price or at that level. I've seen watches for $1,000 that have really good finishing for the price. And by that I mean it's considering what I'm used to seeing at that price point. That on that watch is good comparably. A Seiko or a Hamilton at $1,000 can potentially be a bit rough around the edges on some details, but they can still comparably be better than some other alternatives. My fourth perspective is, and this is to your point of the technical evaluation, quantification does not always make evaluation objectively better. Now, what do I mean by that? Imagine reviewing food and asking the reviewer to do a technical comparison of some dish. Two dishes, get compared, and the data concludes that there was 0.7% more salt in dish number 2, and therefore this dish overall had the statistically correct or best amount of salt for this kind of dish. One dish can be better than the other, but boiling it down to 0.7% salt just isn't helpful. I mean, hopefully you can see that's kind of absurd, right? It's also the same when people say grade 5 is inherently better than grade 2 titanium. It's not. It's just different. A watch isn't inherently better because it's grade 5 or 904L or whatever. It's a material choice that has some benefits and some drawbacks. And depending on what the designer was going for, either choice can be good. So I just don't believe you can take something that is so personal and so subjective as to whether or not you like a watch and boil it down to some point system or rating scale. A graphics card on a computer, that can be measured to be faster than, another graphics card. It's objective. And the same goes for power draw and its price per frame. But a watch is an experience that's personal, and trying to quantify elements of a watch to ascertain which watch is better objectively, to me at least, is a flawed premise. I don't feel you can give different elements of a watch points to objectify its goodness simply because it's a subjective experience. And whatever your objective point system is, it's predicated on your own subjective valuation of which components of the rating system matter. Final perspective, if you watch a video and you see a reviewer say the finishing is excellent and the macro tells you something else, you can conclude only one thing, and that is that your experience of that specific watch is different from that of the reviewer. Are they wrong? No, because it's a subjective experience. But you know that their experience is different to yours, and you can use that information when passing their review. So as an example, maybe you have a bar that says Adrian Barker has lower standards than you when talking about finishing, but Tommaso has the same bar as you. you can use that information when listening to what they say. Then there's also a sixth perspective, which is the reviewer's just being paid to say nice things, of course, and it's just them reading off of a press release. Go on then. Oh, got an English accent there. An easy one. How can it be that one Patek Philippe 5711 link, which is a pushpin link, costs several $100s more than an entire quartz PRX? For me, this is the biggest tell that the luxury world operates on a level few of us will ever see, and they basically charge whatever they think they can. True, they do charge whatever they think they can. That's completely accurate. But let's talk about bracelets and manufacturing for a moment. A couple more perspectives. First of all, you're right. There isn't a linear relationship between the price of a watch and the quality of a watch. The more expensive a watch gets, the more profit they are likely making, and the less the watch production costs make up of the overall cost picture. A Cubitus is $40,000, which makes it about 65 times more expensive than a PRX. It doesn't cost 60 times more to produce. It just doesn't. But, and that's the second thing, it does cost more to produce. I have to be a little bit careful because this is kind of confidential-ish. I had a meeting with one of the suppliers of major brands not long ago, and they showed me for bracelets, not from their factory, but they again, everything's connected. I promised I wouldn't say where these bracelets came from and who was representing them or who was selling them, but this is the interesting part. There were 4 bracelets. The first bracelet was the Asian bracelet, and this bracelet was the starting point for all 4 of the bracelets that this person had brought to show me. Everybody was essentially using this bracelet or a version of it. The thing that got interesting, though, was what happened to the bracelet in the supply chain. The second bracelet went to an European brand, and it was literally unchanged from the original factory bracelet. So basically, a company was just ordering something from a Chinese supplier and just taking it at stock and throwing it on their watch. So number 1 and number 2 were basically more or less identical except for the branding. The third one was markedly better, and it was for a couple of reasons. One, the buyer specifically had paid the Asian supplier more to make the same bracelet at better tolerances. So they changed the push pins. Apparently you can get different kinds of push pins, and they're different qualities, different thicknesses, all that kind of stuff. But they also changed some of the initial manufacturing tolerances. On top of that, they also typically, the brand that was buying them, would spend more time on quality control when the bracelets arrived at their assembly facility, and they sent a lot more back when they weren't good enough. The key here is that the starting point was in principle exactly the same, but because they paid more for some things, the same bracelet was significantly better. This third bracelet that made it through quality control and into the hands of the customer was just much better, despite them being almost visually identical. And then there was the fourth bracelet. Again, and this was more of a proof of concept thing, but it was the same starting point, but massively different. This version was the same as Company 3. So they spec'd the bracelet differently. They had higher quality control. And on top of that, they made massive finishing changes to the bracelet. This was down to polishing and chamfering and all sorts of details. They also didn't use the accompanying clasp. They just got the bracelet and they got a custom clasp from a completely different supplier, and also made a whole lot of changes to the finishing and detailing. So in a simplified way, you wouldn't know that starting point for this bracelet was the same factory in Asia, and there was a marked quality difference between the two. The interesting thing about this is that essentially all 4 of these bracelets started essentially their life in the same town somewhere in China, but they ended up being very, very different because of the standards and the requirements the buyer asked of the vendor, and because of the quality control upon receipt, and also the QC on attaching the bracelet to the case. And in the last case, so much was changed to the bracelet that unless you're in the know, you wouldn't know that they essentially started more or less in the same place. Each 4 of these bracelets were progressively more expensive. And like I said, it's not linear, but the Asian bracelet was good, but the high-end one was awesome. And I've handled a lot of Nautilus bracelets and one single Cubitus. I've also handled a PRX. Patek put some serious quality control and man hours into that bracelet that just doesn't go into a PRX. Not 65 times more, but it's more. Clearly, I'm picking the long questions. I'll tell you what bugs me. All the YouTubers who basically shill Aliexpress and also have outspoken views on actual fakes. Bearing in mind, Aliexpress not only turn a blind eye to fakes being sold, they also pay Google to show Aliexpress sellers results for fake watch searches. Don't believe me? Google clean factory GMT Master 2, click shopping, and there are Aliexpress selling outright fakes, blatant Photoshop pictures, sometimes with Smiths-made text and clean factory dang dong 3285 stickers visible. Overpriced by about $150 too. I understand why no commercial YouTubers are positive about fakes. Just be neutral. If you're going to promote those who sell them, I'm not saying you do. I'm just asking your opinion. You seem quite unbiased, although I do understand you'd not risk YouTube demonetizing you. I hope they don't. I've been in this YouTube space for about 2 years now, and the emails I get the most, more than any other, is Asian brands and Asian sites that want me to promote their products. IWC might politely talk to me and want to get to know me. They reached out after I did a critical video of them a while back, but the Asian brands, they are like super aggressive. Their emails basically all just start with, "You're fabulous, your videos are amazing, how much money do you want to promote our products?" They are by far the most aggressive and most common emails I get. I'm perfectly happy to talk about those brands, and I've talked about them, but I refuse to get paid or get free watches from them. Now, some YouTubers have gone another route. Most of them are completely open and honest about it. They either resell their watches or give them away to viewers, and I'm totally fine with that. They're open with it, they're transparent. No big deal. You want to do that? Cool. People can use that information to make a decision about whether or not their views are biased or not. But that's not the question you're asking. You're talking about turning a blind eye to fakes. My position has always been this: making a Rolex look-alike is fine as long as it doesn't say Rolex on the dial. Pagani at his dive, I don't care. The moment you try to pass off your watch as an actual Rolex, I lose all respect for the producer, the seller, and the customer. It's criminal, it's wrong, end of story. Now, are there some Asian brands making, I don't know, homages out of the front door and pure fakes out of the back? We don't know. We literally don't. I do know that you will find sanctioned American technical components in Iranian Shahed drones being launched at the Ukraine. That's a fact. And they're not getting those components by buying washing machines and pulling out the chips. Ukraine, the latest, has a good coverage of this. BBC also has a coverage of this. There's lots of data about this. The fact is, these components are not getting pulled out of washing machines. They are buying those chips from a sub-vendor that is getting the chips legally and directly from the American manufacturer. It doesn't mean, though, that the American manufacturers are aware that this is what's happening, and it doesn't mean that they're accepting of this. It may mean that their own controls are being circumvented in some way, and they haven't figured out how to catch it yet. It stands to reason that some of the parts that go into illegal watches come from some of the same factories as the legal watches. It doesn't necessarily mean that the factories know that their parts are going into fakes. Just like those microchips, it might be that some American company is circumventing the sanctions against Russia, but it's probably more plausible that somewhere through their controls and their supply chain, some of their parts are getting diverted without their knowledge. It's an Occam's razor kind of thing. One thing is that it's a potentially likely scenario. Another is to prove it and state as a matter of fact that it's the case. You can't do that because saying some specific individual is doing something illegal is slander and cost you in a court of law. So saying somebody is selling fakes, that's just, you don't want to go down that road because if you don't have the facts, you are in trouble. So you have to be very, very mindful of what do you know for a fact and what do you think. And again, like I said, these brands might not know that their products are ending up in fakes. They're sending them to somebody who's moving them onto someone else, and then they make their way into a sweatshop that's making fakes. We don't know that for a fact. We don't know how it's happening. Then there's Aliexpress and Temu. They are essentially a reseller that in what seems like no way regulates a lot of their vendors in the way they would be required to do if they were based inside something like the European Union. And that's likely part of the reason why the EU opened an investigation into Temu and other sites back in October. I think it was back in October, to get Temu and others to regulate their platforms more aggressively. I think I would go so far as to say, mark my words, the EU is going to make rules making it much harder for these Chinese reseller platforms to turn a blind eye to certain practices on their platform. I would give it a couple of years and those sites are going to have a hard time getting access to the EU. And you can say whatever you want about Donald Trump, but this is likely something he would probably choose to crack down on as well because of his generally tough stance on China. So I do think it could happen in the US as well. The days of reseller sites claiming that they are not responsible for the practices of the sellers using their platforms are numbered. Buying stuff cheap from China is coming to an end, I think. Mike, you've covered a lot of brands. I don't remember you ever covering Frederique Constant. Would love to hear your review of them. Frederique Constant are an interesting brand. I think they've been around since the late 1980s, so they're not like a heritage brand. For the longest time, I associated them with like stuffy, chunky, bulbous dress style watches. There was maybe one watch, and I think it was from like the early 2010s, which was, to me, a sign of things to come, and it was their world timer. It was still a little bit chubby, but this was a reasonably good looking and more affordable world timer. At some point in the mid 2010s, Citizen bought them, and today they've got these three main lines, which is the High Life, Classic, and their manufacture watches. The classics, for the most part, aren't really my cup of tea. There are too many Roman numerals, just like Breguet. Some of the cases are still trying a bit too much to look classy and old school for me, and I don't really feel they put it off, again, for me. In the manufacture line, though, there's the world timer, there's a moon phase that I really like. There's also a perpetual calendar which costs under $15,000 or so dollars. More of those designs speak to me because they're just a little bit more modern, but they're still pretty much dress watches. The High Life is a really good integrated bracelet option. They've got a regular one, they've got a chrono, they've got a perpetual calendar. They're all pretty good. If I'm going to be like super nitpicky, the perpetual calendar isn't quite like a perpetual calendar from a Jaeger de Coulter because it's got no year. It only has like, it cycles between the four, the 4 leap years, or the 1 leap year, and they're the 3 years, but you don't actually get the year on the dial. Frederique Constant are an interesting proposition because they do some things that kind of part the waters. Considering what they're offering, they're predominantly in a kind of value space. They offer complications at lower prices than most other similar complications, but because they are what we often refer to as in-house, there's a price to pay. In-house, no matter how you define it, costs more, and you also have a fair discussion about servicing, reliability, parts, all those kind of things. But the fact is, you get a perpetual calendar a lot cheaper than most other brands are capable of. Sure, it's a modular movement. You get an automatic movement with a calendar on top, but it's still pretty impressive considering the price. After a restrained 2024, given the initial market outlook, quite contradictory outcome, do you think a good outlook for 2025 would boost the watchmakers to step up their release game and not stay stuck to safe releases? The watches that got released in 2024 were likely most of them conceived 3 or 6 years ago, especially new watches. Universal Genève were bought in late 2023, and George Kern has stated that you won't see the first for sale models until 2026. Thierry Stern has said a lot of things, but 2 things in particular in this context deserve a call out. And the first is that he has stated that the Cubitus lineup has been fully designed with releases up until 2036, 39, something like that. And let's just take his word for that. Secondly, I think he stated that they started drawing squares on a piece of paper 4 or 5 years ago. And all this is just to say it takes a long time to come up with a new watch. Even more iterative things like a new dial or a different colorway take longer than you think. The other thing to consider is that the watch industry is very much a boom and bust kind of industry, in the sense that when consumers have money to spend, a lot of brands tend to throw as much out there as possible to feed the hunger of the consumers. But the moment the market cools, a lot of the brands tend to get more conservative. They don't want to release something that isn't going to generate the demand that they really want. But it's difficult because they've already got a whole release schedule because it takes so long to get a product ready for launch. So they're faced with the question, do you delay those products you've already got lined up, or do you stagger the launches and stretch out the releases? And what do you do in terms of coming up with new releases? I mean, just think of the Omega Seamaster 300M. Let's just assume that Omega have been thinking about going to 40 millimeters and updating the helium escape valve to a smaller size. Everything in the market is going great, but then suddenly the market starts to contract. What do? Do you extend the lifespan of the current 300M, or do you shift production, which is expensive, to a new form factor, hoping to reignite interest? There's also a bigger question, which is how many games are not going to be released in 2026 because nobody wants to release their game at the same time as Grand Theft Auto 6. Bit of a digression, but I just had to get it in there because it's kind of the same logic. And it leaves us with another question. Is 2025 going to be better than 2024, or the same or worse? I'm not an economist, so I trust what Jerome Powell says from the US Fed, and he seemed to indicate that interest rates are likely not going to go even more down. So my money is not on 2025 being a boom year. With the wildly changing marketing narrative and tilt in the target audience for companies, do you see major brands skewing their product lines towards the tastes of younger crowds? Watches, especially luxury watches, are for grown-ups. The reason is perfectly simple. They're expensive, which means people need to have a decent level of income before they start spending on money on a good watch. Culturally, some things are going to differ. So Scandinavians, where I live, they're going to spend their money on their home decor before their cars. But if you live somewhere else in the world, people spend the money on their cars before they go and spend money on chairs and expensive couches and stuff like that. But most people, bar maybe a McKinsey consultant here and there, are not popping down to Rolex once they've finished with their bachelor's degree to celebrate their first job. There are a lot of watches other than Rolex, but watches are still a thing that come into your life when you start having real disposable income. And that's when you're approaching your 30s, or at least, more so than your early 20s. Having said that, Patek have been throwing denim straps and blue straps and been trying to make their Calatrava lines more youthful in their appeal. The 5226 is a good example of a more modernized Calatrava. The same goes for a 6007G, which has got really strong Nomos vibes. It's got none of that sort of old fart vibe that a 6119G has. Rolex doing pastels in their Oyster Perpetuals is both speaking to women, but it's also to a younger, fresher vibe. When Tudor launched the Pelagos 39, it wasn't a coincidence or an accident that it was marketed both as sporty, but also as a nightlife kind of watch. I think you're seeing a lot of brands tweaking their branding to capture that kind of cool barista craft skibbity riz kind of vibe. But a lot of it is just making something look different. Younger people don't want to wear something that their parents wear. They want to differentiate themselves. So if dad is wearing a watch with Roman numerals like that Breguet, your son or his son is probably not picking a watch with Roman numerals. That was just an example. Consider it a metaphor, not a statement of fact. But I do think that younger audiences are more likely to pick something other than a generic black bezel, black dial diver like a Seamaster or a Submariner or whatever. I think more younger people will be open to those playful watches like Studio Underdog and Moser because they're not Patek, and Baltic because they're not stuffy. For established brands, this is more slow going. You need to move your designs and your looks so you remain interesting and don't start to become perceived as old or stuffy, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't abandon your core strengths. So all change in those big brands is going to be slow, and they'll draw inspiration from smaller, more agile brands and steal wherever they see something working. Would you ever consider a collaboration to produce your own watch? Tough one. Never say never, because a lot of people end up eating their own words when someone waves a wad of cash in front of them. I like to believe that I'm independent, but show me enough money and I'm likely as persuadable as most people. It's just a question of how much money needs to be put on the table. Having said that, the mental image I have of collabs has always been Victoria Beckham and the Range Rover Evoque. This was back in 2012, where Range Rover and Beckham launched a special edition Range Rover, and I remember thinking, what the hell does Victoria Beckham know about making a good car? I also remember the chief designer at Range Rover being angry at Beckham for, in his view at least, having exaggerated how much of a say she actually had. I think to him it was like, yeah, you told us it needed an extra cup holder, and she maybe indicated that she kind of designed the whole car kind of thing. That's at least how he felt. So, I mean, I think the point is, what qualifications do I have? I mean, sure, if you say Rolex, I'd love a this watch, that watch Sky Dweller, and I'd ask for it to be 40 millimeters, so it was a little bit thinner, a little bit smaller. I'd be curious if they could get it on a different dial. I'd be curious if it looked good with guilloche, kind of deal like the 1908, maybe on the sub dial. But honestly, I've got no clue what I'm doing when it comes to design. I know what I like, but knowing what I like and being able to transform that into a creative proposition is super, super difficult. It's a completely different thing, and I don't have that skill. If any of you are super interested in an Omega Seamaster 300M with an engraving of my face on the back, let me know and I'll see if Omega are interested. What do you make of Perezcope and his aggressive attacks on Hodinkee, Ben Clymer? I've always liked the site and thought Ben anything but a huckster. But one does start to question when you read what Perezcope has to say. Is he himself trying to get clicks? I don't know the Perezcope guy any better than you guys. I read his stuff because he often has some really insightful, in-depth research on fakes and origins of watches and all that kind of stuff. I know he's called Clymer out for a Rolex, and I think it was a Space Dweller Air King kind of thing, which I think Perezcope made the case for was a mismatch of different parts, kind of a Frankenstein kind of watch. Can't really remember exactly because it's a while since I read the article. The feeling though I get about the Perez dude is super detail orientated individual with zero policy for. He calls out whoever he feels should be called out, and consequences and relationships be damned. In psychology, there's this theory of personality called the Big Five, which is essentially saying that all people have combinations of traits where there are 5 traits where everybody has them in varying degrees. And it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. I would put my money on the fact that Mr. Perez is very low on agreeableness. Speaking his truth is much more important than making friends or keeping up relationships. It's not that he's out to make enemies. I just think he values facts over keeping the peace and being, in inverted commas, nice. Do you think people are chasing the hyped watches too much instead of getting the ones they really love and connect with? 3 different perspectives on this one. First is we live in a world of hype. Drop shipping was not a thing 20 years ago. Now, today, if you want any product to be exciting, it needs to be drop shipped. It's shoes, it's caps, it's watches more and more. And that's because breaking news, TikTok reels, doom scrolling mean our collective attention span is pretty much as short as that of a goldfish. We see something, we binge it, we move on. That's the nature of a lot of things today. The days where you slowly build a brand over decades, build a catalog of pieces that grow to have a historical significance and build a loyal following they might not be gone, but they're not in the foreground. You come up with an idea, you hyperscale, you drop ship, and you try to maintain momentum. That's how things work today. My second perspective, drop shipping might be annoying and hype is sometimes painful. But the positive is that brands do actually have to try harder to come up with something interesting. Generally speaking, products need to be more distinct from previous products to keep us interested. So in theory, at least, there's more potential for something to be truly new and exciting to be launched. Potentially, at least. Third perspective, I personally try to avoid hype. I also try not to judge hype purchasing. It's so easy to just say that millions of people's brains just shut off when the Moonswatch was released and they bought the plastic thing because the only thing that was functioning was their reptilian brain saying, I have to get what everybody else wants. But that's not true. I think there are a lot of people that love the Moonswatch that they bought and they enjoyed the hunt and everything that was associated with that hype period. Sometimes I do think we overly romanticize that slow burning love for a watch and condemn hype. I think there's room for both perspectives and both as positives. Are there any accessories or fashion items that you're into that aren't watch related? Shoes. Leather shoes, brogues, Oxford, Chelsea's, Chuckers. I love the things. I've got way too many shoes. Almost kicked my wife out of one of our offices just so I could have more room for more shoes. Another thing that's also super expensive, but I love them. What is the cheapest one can go these days to buy a watch that could last a lifetime without swapping movements, as it happens with Powermatic 80 movements, for example? You can get a watch for $500 that potentially could last forever, probably cheaper. I've used this example before. A Patek Philippe Calatrava is literally built with the intent that it can be passed on to the next generation. It's part of their whole branding. A watch like a Tudor Black Bay for $4,400 is built with the intention that it could last a lifetime because the price sort of necessitates it. A Tissot gentleman isn't. And every time I say that, somebody says, "You're wrong, I've had this Tissot or this Longines or this Hamilton for decades and it's going to last forever." I don't dispute that at all. It's not built with the intent to last forever. It might last forever, but it's not built with the intent. Intent is ensuring as a manufacturer that you have a stock of parts for decades to service the watches. Intent is having quality control processes that spends more time on doing both what you call non-destructive and destructive testing under more extreme scenarios to confirm that the watch will last longer. Intent is spending extra on thicker pins for the bracelet and tighter drill tolerances so there's less flex in the bracelet, which means the bracelet won't deform as quickly over time. Some watches are built at a price point where they are built to last. Other watches are not built with that goal in mind. But the fact is, today, a lot of manufacturing is of such a high standard that even if they don't spend the money on the extensive testing or the extra good components, those watches are still going to be really, really solid, potentially at least. Somewhere at Rolex, there's a machine that has an Oysterflex bracelet that's just being bent and flexed for a year non-stop just to see what happens to the thing. That's not happening at the corresponding Chinese factory. They are going to put it through some tests, but nothing as rigorous as Rolex because it costs too much money to do. When it comes to the replacing the movement thing, I don't necessarily think you should view it as proof that a Powermatic 80 isn't a good movement or is a movement that isn't worth servicing. I think it's more of a case that it's overall cheaper to throw in a new movement than to repair it. Think of how much time a watchmaker has to spend decasing a movement, disassembling it, cleaning everything, replacing damaged parts, and reassembling the thing. That's a lot of man hours and dollars per hour. And it's downtime also where you're waiting for your watch to come back. If you just have to pull out the movement and chuck in a new one, it might be wasteful from an environmental perspective, but there's less man hours, which are more expensive, and it reduces the wait time for the customer. It kind of kills the romance about watchmakers and movements, but it's just a whole lot more efficient. So a Christopher Ward with a Sellita SW200 could potentially last a lifetime. So could a Longines Spirit. I'd even go out on a limb and say that a lot of factory brand watches with NH35 movements could potentially last a lifetime. They're not intended for it. Odds are when they break, most people are likely just going to buy something else, but they probably could last forever. But if you want to be sure, I would say $3,000, then you're getting something that's probably going to last forever, or could potentially at least. I had over 200 questions in the post for this Q&A session. I just couldn't get through all of them, so this time I chose these questions. My plan is to revisit the other questions in upcoming videos in the coming months, and there are also some really good questions that are so good that I think they're going to turn into full-length dedicated videos. I just want to end this video with a huge thank you though, from one watch hobbyist to another. Thank you so much for sticking with my channel for all this time. It's really, really appreciated. So thanks a ton. Like, subscribe. Cheers.